Welcome to EPG Padashala. I am Professor B. Hariharan from the Institute of English, University of Kerala. Today, in this paper on 20th century English literature, we will be looking at the module on Ted Hughes, the poetry of Ted Hughes. Now, Ted Hughes was born as Edward James Hughes in the West Riding region of Yorkshire. His father was a carpenter who after that owned a shop, who was a First World War veteran. Now, this did have an impact, a bearing on the kind of poetry that Hughes wrote. Now, the bleak moors, the skies of Yorkshire, the wind, the rain, the hills, all these formed images of nature in Hughes's poetry. And these images of nature that informed his poetry was marked by their lack of pity. It was pitiless. Hughes studied in Pembroke College in Cambridge. He got a fellowship there. He also worked as a wireless mechanic in the Royal Air Force. Ted Hughes met Sylvia Plath, who was studying at Cambridge on a Fulbright fellowship. This was in 1956. Within 4 months, the two of them, these two poets, were married. Sylvia Plath, I'm sure, is a familiar figure to all of you, known for some of her poems, for her confessional poetry. So these two poets got married. What we have to keep in mind when we return to the poetic career of Ted Hughes is that he was familiar, he had read the works of eminent writers like T.S. Eliot, Dylan Thomas, Lawrence, and W.H. Auden. The poetic influence, if one were to talk about it, evident in him included the poetry of W.B. Yeats, G.M. Hopkins, Dylan Thomas, John Crowe Ransom, and other American writers like Robert Lowell and Merwin. It's also been pointed out that Hughes was in some ways influenced or inspired by the poetry of William Blake and this book by Robert Graves, The White Goddess. When Hughes got married, he was already composing poems. On Plath's insistence, one collection of poems was sent out for a competition. And this manuscript that was submitted was very well received by the members of the screening committee, which included none other than W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, and Marianne Moore. This manuscript was selected and it resulted in the publication of the collection Hawk in the Rain. It was published in 1957. So we are entering the poetic career of Ted Hughes. Now, Hughes did travel a lot. He was also championing, as it were, young poets, playwrights, etc. Perhaps we could look at, very briefly perhaps, at a poem like Hawk Roosting. Before we do that, we need to keep in mind, we need to say that Hughes did publish substantially. In about 2 decades' time, he had published 8 major collections. Apart from writing poetry and prose for children, wrote plays for the radio, and he also did write very fine critical essays. Very often, he has been described as an animal poet, now, or a nature poet. But then, I don't think we will be doing full justice to Ted Hughes if we limit our understanding of him as just an animal poet or a nature poet. I think there is this variety, this range that has to be kept in mind when we read Hughes. What we can do now is, before we look at the major themes in Hughes's poetry, we can attempt an analysis of a celebrated poem from this 1960 collection of poetry called Lupercal. This is a very interesting poem where you have, it's titled Hawk Roosting. So there's a hawk perched on a tree and it's looking at everything, it's surveying the whole world, as it were. The hawk here in this collection is not like the hawk in the first collection that we had, that we mentioned, the hawk in the rain. The hawk here is not described from the outside, but the hawk here is described from the inside. Now, when I say that the hawk is described from the inside, what happens is, as we start reading the poem, we get into or inside the head of the poem, and then we get into the state of mind imagined and recreated in this poem, the state of mind of the hawk that is imagined and recreated. This is the insider's view that you have, that you get in a poem like Hawk Roosting. And that, I would say, is what gives this poem its energy, and this is perhaps the reason why and how this poem talks to you. There has been a number of comments, observations, criticisms that have come out on this poem. P.R. King, for example, has tried to talk about this poem and says that there certainly is power mania that is described here, but then it is also a vivid study of the bird. So you have a study of power mania on the one hand, and also a vivid study of the hawk itself. This poem has been seen as some kind of a political allegory, as a poem that talks about the fascist nature of people who are in power, who would like to control people, who would like to have absolute power in their hands. The sheer ruthlessness, the arrogance, the eccentricity, the megalomaniac nature of dictators, for example. One can even think of figures like Hitler, which would be appropriate because it takes you back again to the war, and particularly the First World War, when Ted Hughes was a young boy, and of course he was grown up, a young man, when the Second World War happened. So these perhaps could be read in, not directly, but then perhaps this thought processes could be seen in the, let's say, the consciousness of the hawk, which we see as we enter the thought processes of the hawk. There is no compassion in this poem. It shows you the bird. It insists on the isolation of the bird. It talks about the brute strength of the bird. There is no compassion. There's a remarkable way in which the poem seems to be springing up from this expression that we have in English, bird's eye view. Now it's the hawk's eye view, and it's an all-seeing, all-powerful eye. It's an eye that records everything and knows what to do. It's that vision that you have. There is this very big ego. By the time you finish reading the poem, you realize that the hawk is the absolute embodiment of power. This is very clear when we read the hawk boasting that it took the whole of creation to produce its foot and each feather. This is where you feel not the beat of the wings, but then the way in which the hawk's vision, its eyes, hold the entire world. You imagine this bird perched on top of a tree, holding with its claws the branch, and then holding the world with its eyes. And then the bird says, "Now I hold creation in my foot." Look at the height of megalomania here. This is the reason why we would talk about Hughes as a poet of energy. There's so much of vitality here. Now, this is not a poem that is finding fault with the hawk or is being very critical of the hawk. It's looking at nature. It's looking at the world around. Nature red in tooth and claw, or nature red in tooth and claw. That's what it is. It's nature presented, our surroundings presented in all its elements without being pruned. It's quite possible to give this hawk anthropomorphic characteristics or qualities, and that's when we would say that this is a poem. The hawk prides itself as an apotheosis of power, or that it is like a dictator. But then that's another level of it. That is, if you want to ascribe anthropomorphic qualities to it, this is what you get. But then you have many other Hughes poems which celebrates the basic urges in our surroundings, animal urges in our surroundings. You have descriptions of animals, birds, fish. There's a poem called Pike, for example. What we then recognize is that there are these poems that work on multiple levels. So you might have a literal level, you might have an ironic level, you might have a symbolic level. Consider, for example, a poem like Thought Fox. Now, Thought Fox can be seen as a poem that operates at a symbolic level rather than an intended level. A fox is something that we all can understand, but what's a thought fox? This is a poem that can be seen as some kind of a poetic manifesto, Hughes's poetic manifesto. You have this evening, it's dark, and then you have somebody trying to sit down and write, and there is this movement somewhere in the dark, 1, 2, 3, 4, just like that, and then you have these footsteps, and there's a flash, it vanishes, and at the end of it, it's very quick, these marks of the paw of the fox, and then the poem ends by saying, and the page is printed. So you have poetic composition on the one hand, and then you have this movement here. It's very precise. There is no flourish, as it were, no unnecessary use of adjectives. Now this is what you have here. So this is again perhaps Hughes's poetic practice could be seen as something unique in this sense. We have talked about at least 2 of his poems. Now I think we need to be looking at some of the things that we had said earlier that had to do with the marriage of Ted Hughes with Sylvia Plath. We did talk about energy poet and animal poet, and we try to celebrate the kind of poetry that Ted Hughes was writing. But we should not be carried away by that, because the marital life again was not all that comfortable, all that happy. The 2 of them did have children, but then after the second child was born, the marriage was on the rocks. There was marital discord. They started living apart, and a few years later, about 7 years into their marriage, Sylvia Plath in 1963 committed suicide. This is the reason why I thought it's important that we mention at least 2 poems, that we mention Hawk Roosting and Thought Fox. That's the reason why I talked about his poetic manifesto, Thought Fox as a kind of poetic manifesto. Because when Sylvia Plath died, Hughes became silent. He was silent for 3 long years. Before Sylvia Plath died in 1963, Hughes had published Lupercal, in which we find a poem like Hawk Roosting. This is a volume that really continued or confirmed the kind of promise that one saw in the first collection of poetry. Hughes stopped writing poetry when his wife died, and then he devoted his time to writing for children, and he wrote radio plays also. 1967, he came back with the publication of Woodhead. Now there's so much of primitivism and mythology that shaped his thought, and this is what you see influencing this collection titled Woodhead. In 1970, Hughes married again, and he celebrated this marriage in 1979 collection called Moortown. He also collaborated with the American artist Leonard Baskin, which was a very, very fruitful collaboration. The two of them produced books of poems and painting that illustrated their works. This was something very, very mutual. At one point, Baskin wished for poems that would go alongside his paintings, his drawings, particularly of crows. And now this prompted Ted Hughes to write the crow sequence in 1966, and thus was born the crow poems. Now the crow poems are very interesting because what you have there is another fascinating take, one must say, a very, very fascinating take on creation myths, particularly myths, stories about the creation of the world, stories about the creation of man and woman. We had talked about how Baskin wanted poems to be written for his drawings of the crow. Now what I am going to do now is to recite for you a few lines from the crow poems, which is about creation. I did talk about the creation myths. Now there is this crow that is a trickster figure, and then let us listen to what the crow does. I'll read out a few lines from this poem and then also share with you the comment that is made about the crow poem, at least this part. Here what I'm going to do is read out what the crow does. This is the act of the crow. He shifted into man the tail half with the wounded end hanging out. He stuffed the head half head first into woman, and it crept in deeper and up to peer out through her eyes, calling its tail half to join up quickly, quickly, because oh, it was painful. These are the lines. Now, P.R. King has talked about the crow poems and this poem in particular, and he says that it is a sardonic view of sex. He also observes that this is one of the most successful of the individual poems. It creates speedily and simply with force and black humor an alternative to the traditional biblical creation story. We also now recognize something more in Ted Hughes than what we were talking about. The kind of humor, for example. The way in which he works with mythology. The way in which he recreates very familiar narratives. Now, this is possibly a model that we have. The kind of possibilities, the kind of things that Hughes was able to see in the things, in the natural phenomenon around him, and out of that he was able to create poetry. So this is a very good example of what Hughes tried to do with stories, with things that are very commonly found. Imagine writing a series of poems on a black crow. Now this is not the first time that we have poems on crow. You have earlier a poem like The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, but then this is very, very different because you have here the trickster figure and narratives, the stories that we tell, the poems that we tell, they all share some quality of this. Some of the major themes in Hughes's poetry. Violence is a theme. It's a very major theme in Hughes's poetry. The presence of the animal world, this is something that we have seen. This is a major presence in Hughes's poetry. Primitivism, when we talk about primitivism in anthology, one can find that he uses the crow, creates, as I said earlier, an alternate story, creation myth, and then there's a way in which he transforms the crow into a kind of trickster figure. So you have Hughes's interest in the crow and trickster mythology emerging here. Myths about vaudeville, and there are other myths also that in which he was interested. Hughes was very much interested in shamanism, and he also did write poems about war. Now these are some of the broad areas that you can find in the poetry of Ted Hughes. What we will do now is very briefly look at some of the things that figure in each one of these. There are many examples for poems that he wrote which address this theme of violence. What I will do now is to list out some of these very popular poems that talk about violence. Jaguar is a very famous poem. You feel the power of the jaguar that is caged in this poem. It's a poem that communicates to you very easily the raw power of this jaguar that is now kept in a cage. Esther's tomcat, look at all these animals here. Esther's tomcat, view of a pig, the bull Moses, an otter, thrushes. It's not the darkling thrush of Thomas Hardy, thrushes. And there's this poem that he has about fishes, pike. You will see the world in all its elements in these poems. There's so much of life in it, there's so much of violence in it. But when we read the poems, we will not, or we simply cannot wish away this violence. And then there's this jaguar poem. There you have the second glance at a jaguar. This is another poem. All these depict animal violence. There are poems that present human violence as well. I'll give you one example. There's a poem titled "The Martyrdom." I would urge you to take a look at that poem. Now look at the animal world. When you look at the animal world, you find that here is a poet who has said a lot, who has celebrated the world of animals. Now I would like to read out to you two short quotations from Ted Hughes on poetry and his thoughts on poetic composition, what he has to say about writing a poem. Now, Hughes in Poetry in the Making says that the secret of writing poetry successfully is, he says, these are his words, to imagine what you are writing about, see it and live it, just look at it, touch it, smell it, listen to it, turn yourself into it. This is a nice way of talking about writing poetry. This is poetry for Ted Hughes. This is the way in which he writes poetry. I had mentioned earlier about thought fogs. We had also talked about hawk roosting. We talked about how it's from the inside. You are inside the mind of the hawk. This is very much what Ted Hughes himself has to say about thought fogs. He has written of this poem, Thought Fox. He has said this about thought fogs. Every time anyone reads it, this poem, the fox will get up somewhere out of the darkness and come walking towards them. Now, isn't that interesting? That every time anyone reads it, the fox will get up somewhere out of the darkness and come walking towards them. Is that violence? This is the animal world that you have in Ted Hughes. We have talked about death. We have talked about the world that he created. All this, there is this underlying violence in all this. Deaths, the predators, all these are very violent. Now, about this kind of violence in Hughes, this critic Woodhead, who has written extensively on Hughes, has remarked, I quote him, "Those who survived do so by virtue of their single-mindedness." It's a determination. What some readers find most unsettling is the extent to which Hughes appears at times to glorify the strength and determination of the survivor to the point where he fails to sympathize with the plight of the defeated. Now, this is what Woodhead has to say. That gives you an idea of the world, the poetic world that Ted Hughes created. We had talked about many of the thematic concerns, and there is one area that needs to be remarked upon that has to do with Hughes' take on war. Remember, his father was a First World War veteran. Now, Hughes does not glorify war. He does not idealize soldiers for taking part in war. He does not think of war in terms of patriotism. Heroism or victory in war is not something that Hughes celebrated. War for him is something that he abhorred. It was horrifying for him. Now, this is what we get to see in a poem like Out that he wrote. That was one important war poem that he wrote. We have seen a whole range of concerns in the poetry of Ted Hughes. We have been able to list out a number of poems. Now, let's look at the other major works of Ted Hughes. Now, he has written lyrics for children. So, we had talked about the energy here, the animal element in his poetry. At the same time, a collection like Season Songs, published in 1976, was originally written for children on the turning of seasons. There again, you have this fascination with the environment in which he was living, all the four seasons. Poems were followed by Cave Birds, Remains of Emlet, Moortown. Now, birthday letters were published a few weeks before Hughes died in 1998. These letters are very intense because these letters dealt with the tragic relationship that he had with Sylvia Plath. It also won a whole lot of awards. Michael Schmidt, for example, termed his work as an attempt to address a loss without self-pity, with as much precision as his memory would allow, answering with unusual quietness and with his eyes averted from those decades of savage and malicious critics and gossips. He's trying to resolve a relationship which was his and hers but has become legendary. Now, I think it's important that that I read this out to you in full because there were a whole lot of rumors, there were readers, there was opinion that Hughes did not treat Sylvia Plath kindly. So this collection of letters in a way lays to rest some of these rumors and gossip that was circulating. Now to conclude, I think we have seen a poet who who takes the reader through many different kinds of worlds. The world of children, the world of animals, the world of violence, the world of myths. We see an artist a poet who is able to retell and recreate stories. There is, in other words, we do recognize a very strong, a very powerful narrative voice, that here is a poet who could tell stories. It was not just emotional states. There could be, it was not just it was not that you have a poet who focused exclusively on just one theme and that was it. Very often what happens when we read Hughes is that we get carried away by the animal poems, so to speak, and then we forget that there was this other Hughes, that there are many Ted Hugheses in his creative writing. So I do hope that this lecture would probably prompt you to take a look at some of the very popular and anthologized Ted Hughes poems, which will help you to understand better the kind of poetry that he was writing, would help you to understand the whole process through which the poet's mind would go as he or she is trying to compose a text. And the best way in which to end this lecture would be to be reminded again of Thought Fox and the way in which that poem ends. Wherever, when you read this poem, you would somehow feel that there is this fox that is walking towards you. And let's hope that Ted Hughes' poetry, as you read it, would walk towards you and make your experience of reading poetry that much more richer. Thank you.